happened to the increase in minimum salary levels in the US? A quick background and an update. So in the US, to be classified as exempt, meaning you're paid a set salary no matter how many hours you work, so you don't get extra pay for overtime, that's what's called exempt. Non-exempt is when you're eligible for overtime. So in the US, at a federal level, there are two tests you generally have to meet: how much you make and what you do. Now, sometimes there are some exceptions, but in the how much you make test, that's gone up periodically over time. But so for the last few years, it had been about 35,600. But in 2024, under President Biden's administration, the Department of Labor was increasing that significantly. So July 1st, it was going up to about 44,000. And then January 1st, it was going up to about 59,000, was going to increase automatically thereafter. So really big jumps. And again, these were the minimum levels. So people had to either make more than that or be converted to non-exempt. So all of a sudden, if you were working more than 40 hours a week, you would either work less or get overtime. But what happened is, and it was a little unusual because there were court challenges that happened where groups said these shouldn't take effect, these are illegal. The Department of Labor doesn't have authority to increase it this much. So different employers, including like the state of Texas. Well, a court, like the Texas federal court, they actually struck it down right before the increase in July was supposed to take effect. They just struck that down for the state of Texas as like a government employer, but it still took effect for everybody else. But at the very end of the year of 2024, a court actually struck down the whole rule overall, and including the increase that had already taken effect in July. So there were employers that their exempt employees were making 35,600. They moved those up to about 44,000. And then we're getting ready to move those up to 59,000 or convert them to non-exempt when a federal court said, halt, we're not going to do any of this. And so it created all these complexities. I've made video about this, how some employers, for example, Ohio State, they actually reverted some employees that had already gotten pay increases, they took them back to lower levels. And so they gave pay increases and then took them away. But when this happened, the Department of Labor, when their rule gets struck down in court, they get to decide whether to appeal, and they did appeal. So the U.S. Department of Labor went to the Courts of Appeal, which is one level below the Supreme Court, and they said, we had the authority to do this, so these rules should take effect. And so those were getting started in the appeals court process when there became a new presidential administration, because President Biden left office and President Trump took office. And so when that happens, he put in a new Department of Labor, the head of the Department of Labor. And so what's happened in court is the Department of Labor, through their lawyers who are from the Department of Justice, they've issued a motion basically saying to the court, can we halt this? Because we want to talk about what we actually want to do with this, because there's a new president. We don't know if we still want to keep pushing this increase in rules, so give us some time to talk about it. So that just happened at the very end of April. And the judge there said, okay, we're going to halt this appeal for 120 days, but every 60 days, so basically by the end of June, give an update on where you are. And so the Department of Labor now has to decide, do we want to push for another salary increase, a minimum salary increase? And a lot of the expectations are, well, first of all, that they're not going to keep pushing this lawsuit because the levels were so high. And it's really unlikely, most people think, that even if they won at the Court of Appeal level, that it would survive at the Supreme Court. So the chances of these minimum levels ever taking effect from what they were put into that rule isn't very likely. And so what most people would expect is that the Department of Labor will say, we're going to abandon this appeal. And why people often think that is this is actually exactly what happened in 2017. Because President Obama had an increase to the salaries that got struck down in a Texas federal court. And President Trump, when he took office, then his Department of Labor halted those appeals. And in his first administration, President Trump his Department of Labor basically had a compromise amount. They increased it to the 35,600 current level. And so there's some questions about whether President Trump's administration now, that Department of Labor, would look to have a compromised amount. But most people that I've looked haven't expected that to necessarily be a priority. But so those increases that were scheduled to take effect last year never took effect. They're still barely alive in court, but most expect that there'll never be a decision that actually makes those effective. So the question will just be, what happens in court? And then what does the Department of Labor do?